President Trump calling his first official foreign trip as commander-in-chief a home run. So what did it tell us about the state of his foreign policy? Let's bring in Claudia Rosett, the Foreign Policy Fellow at the Women's Independent Forum. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It did seem to some extent that he kept to the script, that he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish. They've come back feeling they had a great trip abroad, and when Washington has been a bit more of a chaos as far as messaging is concerned. How do you think that trip abroad went?
I think it went extremely well. Look, the bottom line mission that he had to accomplish on this trip was to tell the world that America will start standing up for its own interests again. And I think he did very well on that. In fact, the disconcerted Angela Merkel in Germany, I think, is a sign of success. It was a good trip.
He also didn't take questions, didn't hold a press conference, and this is someone that really seems to enjoy doing that, the sparring with the press. I mean, what does that say about how he planned this trip and executed it?
I'm actually, speaking as somebody who has spent a career as a member of the press, I'm less concerned about that than about the message he's been sending to the world with what he's actually been doing. In other words, we've heard a lot of press conferences over many years, and I'm all for officials talking to the press, but I don't think that's actually germane. What mattered was that he went to Saudi Arabia and he gave a speech not talking about relative values or moral relativism, but saying we must actually defeat Islamist terrorism. And he then went straight to Israel, which was quite a statement in itself. He spoke with the Israelis, he spoke with the Palestinians, he then went to the Vatican, and then probably at least as significant, I think immensely important, he stopped at Sigonella to visit a military base on the way back. I think we should not ignore that it was the military base from which planes might have reached the beleaguered Americans in Benghazi in 2012. And there he talked about the importance of the military. This was all, as well as telling members of NATO that they needed to pay what they had promised to pay. In other words, they needed to buy in to the defense against what is certainly an increasingly dangerous Russia. So I think overall there are things I would criticize here and there. By and large, great. And I hope he gives a press conference soon where people can ask lots about this.
When we talk about immigration, this was something that the president campaigned on very strongly. That phrase, Muslim ban, seems to cling to him despite the administration's attempt to clarify their policy. And when he went overseas, he was greeted so warmly by members, by leaders in the Arab world, and by Muslims. And he seemed to soften his tone as far as the Muslim community is concerned, but at the same time called on the Muslim community to take action, to kind of hold them accountable for the attempts to rein in terrorism around the world.
I think what you're seeing there is a difference between American domestic politics, which right now is very nasty, very ugly, and very complicated, and the real concerns of other countries. And abroad right now, the concerns are not only real, but increasingly worrisome. We have seen a rising network of dangerous actors over the past decade or so. As opposed to the 1990s, following the Soviet collapse, when we had a period of the peace dividend and a lot of America as the lone superpower, and things are now going to calm down and be peaceful. Right now, you have an increasingly aggressive and dangerous Russia, an emboldened and increasingly aggressive China, an Iran that will not be contained by President Obama's Iran nuclear deal, a North Korea that has become not just an intractable problem, but an urgent one. It's testing nuclear weapons and missiles at a rate that we cannot allow to go on, yet what do we do? All of this, that's the kind, and ISIS, by the way, right? Jihadi movements. These are the things that countries in the Middle East, that Europe actually, that countries abroad are worried that outside the Washington Beltway, outside America, people are worried about. That's why they wanted to see what's the American president going to do or talking about or interested in.
And the White House feels it was an impactful trip. Claudia Rosett, thank you for joining us on this Memorial Day where we remember for generations all of the people that have kept us safe for all these many, many years. Thank you for joining us.